Another very important electrolyte is potassium. Potassium is one of the most common intracellular cations, and it's maintained mainly by the sodium-potassium pump. So it's going to be influenced by the same hormones that influence sodium in our system, aldosterone. Potassium, though, is super important. We have to maintain our levels between 3.5 and 5 molar equivalents, or milliequivalents, per liter. If we don't, this electrolyte can cause our heart rate or our cardiac muscle and our diaphragm to either contract and not be able to relax properly or stop functioning. And in both cases, this can lead to heart failure and respiratory failure and then death. So potassium is typically found in our cells, but it does move to the extracellular region through potassium channels with sodium-potassium pump. It also moves in opposition with hydrogen ions. So when hydrogen ions move inside the cell, potassium runs out of the cell. This allows us to maintain electrolyte balance within the blood plasma. Some hormones influence the release of potassium. So insulin, which decreases blood glucose levels, also causes blood potassium levels to be decreased. And that can lead to, if you are not getting enough potassium in the first place, that can lead to hypopotassemia. But typically, we get a lot of potassium in our foods, so hypopotassemia is not very common. And what the insulin does is it actually protects us from hyperpotassemia. So here we're constantly monitoring our potassium balance using mainly the hormone aldosterone to monitor as sodium is reabsorbed. They're going to secrete more potassium into our urine. And there are different influences other than aldosterone. We're going to have potassium move between the intracellular fluid and blood plasma, dependent on the amount of potassium in our blood plasma to try and keep it at that, 4 milliequivalents per liter. But if hydrogen ions move into our cells, then potassium moves out. And then, of course, if insulin is influencing our potassium, then it's going to cause us to take more potassium into our cells, decreasing the amount of potassium in our blood plasma. Chloride ions also are found are the most common, that's what I should say, extracellular anion. They are typically going to be found anywhere sodium is. Sodium and chloride are like best friends. They constantly want to be right by each other because they complement each other very well. So we're going to find chloride ions inside or outside of the cells in blood plasma and in interstitial fluid. You do have some chloride ions that are found inside of cells. It's not as common. We use chloride ions to produce hydrochloric acid inside of our stomach. We use chloride ions to help our water secretions, fluid secretions in our lungs so that we don't get thick, sticky mucus. We have a more lubricated mucus. So calcium is found in bone and teeth. The majority of our calcium is going to be found inside of our cells in bone and teeth, but we do have calcium inside of other cells. So muscle cells tend to have calcium storage sites called the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. It's a special type of endoplasmic reticulum known as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. in muscles, and calcium is needed in those muscles so that muscle contractions can occur. Calcium is often lost in urine because it's hard to be reabsorbed or hard to be absorbed. And so we have to have a lot of different hormones that help us to keep calcium levels in our blood. We have 3 basic hormones that work to regulate blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone, produced by our parathyroid glands, is going to cause our bone cells to break down the bone. So those are those osteoclasts. And that's going to release calcium into our blood. Parathyroid hormone also causes phosphate excretion. So phosphate will be released into urine. Calcium will be kept in the blood. When parathyroid hormone is released, that activates the kidneys to release calcitriol. Calcitriol increases reabsorption of calcium. So we're going to have more reabsorption of calcium from the foods that we have eaten and the drinks that we have drank. And we're going to build up our calcium store in our blood again. So calcium is very important in muscle contractions, nervous impulses, as well as in blood clotting. And if you remember, we also used calcium as a second messenger once in a while in the nervous system for those protein hormones. The last ion that we'll talk about is the phosphate ion. Phosphate ions are found in intracellular fluid, and they are regulated by the same mechanisms that calcium ions are regulated by. We use phosphate in the production of a lot of our nucleic acids, ATP, but it's also an intracellular buffer, which we'll talk about later on in this chapter. Now let's talk about some of the functions of our hormones. So angiotensin 2 is one of our best blood pressure increasers. It has very, very strong vasoconstriction. It is produced by the liver and then activated by both renin and ACE. And when it's converted to angiotensin 2, it causes blood vessels to constrict, which decreases the amount of fluid we release, and it's going to activate other hormones. So this, in a sense, is going to raise our blood pressure. We're going to have a decrease in urine because we are producing less filtrate, so that our blood pressure is maintained at a higher volume where it's supposed to be. So typically angiotensin 2 is going to be released when blood pressure starts to drop. Angiotensin stimulates our thirst center. So angiotensin 2, stimulates the thirst center, which is going to cause us to take in more fluid, which will then increase blood pressure. It's going to stimulate the hypothalamus to release antidiuretic hormone and stimulate the adrenal glands to produce aldosterone. Angiotensin 2 is going to be decreased when blood pressure is normal. The decrease of angiotensin 2 is typically associated with the increase in blood pressure. So when our blood pressure increases, we stop producing angiotensin 2. We no longer need to produce renin, which activates the production of angiotensin 2. So here, this is a negative feedback mechanism. This is a picture from your book. Here we're going to start with some stimulus. This is low blood pressure, which stimulates the kidneys, juxtaglomerular cells, to release renin. Renin moves into the blood and it activates angiotensinogen, which is produced by our liver, to be converted to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 moves into the lungs, or pulmonary circulation, where ACE converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the production of aldosterone, the production of antidiuretic hormone. It activates our thirst center, and it causes us to decrease the amount of urine we produce. It causes vasoconstriction of our blood vessels, so we don't produce as much filtrate. Antidiuretic hormone, then, produced by the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary gland, stimulates vasoconstriction, or I shouldn't say vasoconstriction, that sounds wrong, constriction of the sweat pores. So the lumens that open to the surface of our skin get constricted so we don't lose water from sweat. It also acts on our kidneys to produce extra aquaporins, which it will then allow us to increase the amount of fluid in our system. This is what I just said. Oh, angiotensin 2 is one of the stimuli in the production of antidiuretic hormone. If we have low blood pressure, that's going to stimulate antidiuretic hormone release. And I already mentioned this as well. Antidiuretic hormone increases water reabsorption and causes minimal vasoconstriction of blood vessels, but it also causes constriction of the sweat pores so that they don't release sweat. And then here's your antidiuretic hormone. So we have low blood volume, so increased blood osmolarity. We release angiotensin 2. This stimulates the hypothalamus to respond by producing antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone acts on our blood vessels. It acts on, and you don't see this, but acts on our sweat pores. It's not in this. As well as acting on the renal tubules. This increases water reabsorption and decreases the amount of water we lose. It increases our blood pressure, which is what we want. A disorder associated with antidiuretic hormone, which is really kind of interesting and we've talked about already, it's called diabetes insipidus. This results from low secretion of antidiuretic hormone or from receptors that are faulty within the kidney tubules. And this can cause us to lose lots of fluid every day. So diabetes insipidus is going to be, or symptoms of diabetes insipidus is going to be loss of lots of fluids, so very large quantities of urine production, and high levels of thirst. Aldosterone, this is our salt-loving hormone produced by our kidneys. It's going to be released when angiotensin 2 is produced and when we have low blood plasma levels of sodium or high blood plasma levels of potassium. It's known as your salt-loving molecule. So it increases sodium-potassium pumps, causing sodium to be released into the blood and potassium to be brought back into the cells. It decreases urine release of salt, increases potassium release, though. So sodium stays, potassium is released. And here we have aldosterone. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about because I've only got 30 seconds left. So here we have angiotensin 2 release because we have decreased blood sodium levels, increased blood potassium levels, and typically low blood pressure. Stimulates the adrenal glands to release aldosterone. Aldosterone moves into our system and increases the amount of sodium in our blood, decreases the amount of potassium in our blood, causes potassium to be released as urine, but causes sodium to be reabsorbed. Goodbye.